Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, Crossing New Frontiers to Conquer Today's Challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine.
Thank you very much. I'm Philip Emeagwali. Parallel supercomputing is an entirely new approach to modern computer science. Yet, there is a limit to the theoretically unlimited speed of the parallel supercomputer. Looking back, in 1946, the fastest computer in the world used only one scalar processing unit. In 1988, the fastest computer in the world still computed with only one vector processing unit. Shortly after the US Independence Day of 1989, the media reported that an African supercomputer wizard in the United States of America had discovered how the most massively parallel supercomputer ever built can massively compute with 65,536 commodity processors and solve 65,536 computational physics problems and solve them simultaneously. 9 in 10 supercomputer cycles are executed while solving extreme scale systems of equations of algebra and physics. I had figured out how to finesse my 64 binary thousand processors, enabling them to communicate and collaborate to reduce the time to solution of extreme scale systems of equations of algebra, and to reduce that time to solution from 65,536 days or 108 years on one isolated processor to just 1 day across an ensemble of 65,536 processors. That new knowledge enabled those processors to compute quickly and accurately, and to make the impossible to solve systems of equations of extreme scale algebra possible to solve. I introduced how to use that new knowledge in algebra and thus build digital replicas of petroleum reservoirs and the Earth's climate. I want to be remembered as the first person to witness the transition from the computer that did one thing at a time to the supercomputer that did many things at once. I believe that our children's children will coin a new word for their supercomputers. They will invent supercomputers that are science fiction to us. I discovered a new way of thinking about the new fastest supercomputer and about the supercomputer of tomorrow, not as a computer per se, but as a global network of tightly coupled processors that is an internet. My discovery was processor agnostic and was a blueprint for a never before seen internet. The invention of a faster supercomputer is a milestone of human progress. That invention made some impossible to solve problems arising in physics, algebra, and calculus possible to solve. I'm Philip Emeagwali. I remember the day I first programmed a supercomputer. It was June 20, 1974. I remember that date in part because I was on the cover of a local newspaper that was published 3 weeks later, and because then US President Richard Nixon was forced to resign 18 days later. Back in mid-July 1974, the half-dozen Nigerians in Polk County of Oregon were proud to see my photo on the cover of their local newspaper. That newspaper was on the newsstands of the Oregonian cities of Monmouth and Independence. The Nigerians that read that article came to congratulate me. Nigerians crowded into my tiny one-room studio apartment that was at 195A South North Street, Monmouth, Oregon. That evening, we talked about the recent resignation of then US President Richard Nixon. That evening, we went to see a performance in Monmouth, Oregon, that was delivered by the mentalist called the Amazing Kreskin. I remember the day my discovery of practical parallel supercomputing was highlighted by the Wall Street Journal, and remember it as June 20, 1990, not because I was in the Wall Street Journal per se, but because I started programming conventional supercomputers exactly 16 years earlier on June 20, 1974, and at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, United States. I remember by association, not memorization, and for that reason, friends say that I have a photographic memory, an elephant memory, called an eidetic memory. I was asked, how did Philip Emeagwali become a father of the internet? When I began supercomputing back on June 20, 1974, in Corvallis, Oregon, United States, I did not embark on a quest to become a father of the internet. But if the father of the airplane is the person that invented the first airplane, then the father of the internet should be the person that invented the first internet. I am the only father of the internet that invented a new internet. And I am known as the first person to program a new internet that I visualized as a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors that I also visualized as being equal distances apart from each other. Those 65,536 processors had separate memories from each other, with each processor operating its own operating system. It made the news headlines in 1989 that I discovered that new internet to be a virtual supercomputer. My physical experiments across my ensemble of tightly coupled commodity off-the-shelf processors gave me the street cred that is akin to that of the prophet that became a political prisoner, or that of the poet whose wife committed suicide. I'm Philip Emeagwali. Students writing school reports on great inventors often ask, what is Philip Emeagwali known for? In abstract geometrical terms, I'm known for defining and delineating the technology called parallel processing and for precisely describing it as the vital technology that enables supercomputing across the surface of a globe. That globe is embedded within a 16-dimensional hyperspace and I'm known for discovering that supercomputer as a never before seen internet that is a new global network of 2 raised to power 16 or 65,536 tightly coupled processors that were identical to each other, that shared nothing between each other, with each processor operating its own operating system. Back in 1989, I was in the news for discovering practical parallel processing, the technology that enables the modern supercomputer to solve many real-world problems at once, instead of solving only one problem at a time. Massively parallel processing enabled me to solve one grand challenge problem of mathematical physics that is an ensemble of 65,536 challenging problems of computational physics and solve them synchronously. Loosely speaking, and in theory, the computer that is powered by only one processor can solve a grand challenge problem that the parallel supercomputer that is powered by 1 billion processors can solve. However, the computer takes 1 billion days, or nearly 3 million years, to solve a grand challenge problem that the parallel supercomputer takes only 1 day to solve. However, it took me 16 years, onward of March 25, 1974, to understand the physics, calculus, and algebra, and arithmetic, or to understand the human process of solving that grand challenge problem. I had to understand that process before I can instruct my ensemble of 64 binary thousand processors on how to massively parallel process the grand challenge problem that I divided into as 65,536 smaller problems. I was in the news because I discovered practical parallel supercomputing, or how to solve many problems at once or in parallel, and how to simultaneously solve 65,536 problems across 65,536 tightly coupled processors and solve them at the same time. What is the Philip Emeagwali Internet? Even after I had won the top prize in supercomputing and won it after 16 years of supercomputing, it took another 16 years for many supercomputer scientists to understand that I had parallel processed across a new internet, and that I invented a new internet that was a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. That 16-year delay or adjustment period was due to the fact that parallel processing across a new internet was very difficult to understand. Parallel processing empowered me to invent a virtual supercomputer that is a new internet that retains the illusion of being a computer per se. On the blackboard, my new internet exists almost to the point of complete abstraction. My new internet is the invincible and the marginal technology that haunts the transitory zones where the boundaries between mathematical physics and computational physics, and between computing and supercomputing, are blurred. My definition of an internet is a metaphor that destabilizes the textbook meaning of the word computer that in turn was first used in print 2,000 years ago and first used by the Roman author Pliny the Elder. I was asked, why is Philip Emeagwali called a father of the internet? I am called a father of the internet because I am the only father of the internet that invented a new internet. Inventing a parallel supercomputer that costs more than the annual budget of each of the 40 poorest nations in the world is tougher than writing a book of poetry. And tougher in part because to invent is to make the impossible possible. That's why 50,000 fiction books are published each year in the United States alone. That's why 300,000 books are published each year in the United States alone, with the average book selling less than 250 copies. In contrast, it took half a century to invent a new supercomputer and to progress from the Turing supercomputer of 1939 that in theory could solve a system of 29 equations of algebra. It took 50 years to progress to the parallel supercomputer of 1989 that made the news headlines when I used it to solve 24 million equations of large-scale algebra that was then a world record. For this reason, inventing a new supercomputer is rarer than writing a best-selling book. The number of self-published books is over 1 million a year. You cannot read the same book 10 times. However, 10,000 programmers can program the same supercomputer and do so at once. If you are a writer, you can write 1,000 words every day. If you are a mountain climber, you cannot become the first person to climb Mount Everest, the highest mountain, and climb it every day. You cannot break that historical record every day. If you are an inventor, you cannot invent a new internet every day. The reason it is easier to write than to invent is that the writer creates her literature, hence the term creative writer. But it is impossible to have a quote-unquote creative discoverer. You can write 1 page a day and complete a novel in 1 year. But you cannot write 1 page a day and invent a new supercomputer or invent a new internet and do so every year. Writing is infinite, but inventing is finite. Great scientific discoverers are rare simply because groundbreaking discoveries that are prerequisites to becoming a great discoverer are also rare. Great scientific discoverers are rare because they can only discover a thing that pre-exists, and the discoverer's genius has nothing to do with the pre-existence of her discovery. Great inventors are rare because the inventor can only invent what's possible to be invented. Great inventors are rare because they cannot invent a law of physics or invent a perpetual motion machine. 2,000 years ago, the Roman author Pliny the Elder became the first person to use the word computer. For 2 millennia, the name computer remained the same. However, the basic premise that defined the fastest computer has changed. It changed from the supercomputer that computed only one thing at a time or in sequence to the supercomputer that solved millions of problems across millions of processors and at once or in parallel and in a one problem to one processor corresponded manner. The supercomputer continuously redefined itself just as each generation of supercomputer scientists redefined itself. For simplicity and uniformity, and to avoid being a prisoner of details, I use the word computer to describe computing machineries that my generation also called CPUs or processors, nodes or cores, parallel computers or quantum computers, microcomputers or supercomputers, and so on. What does a supercomputer look like? A supercomputer needs email wires that total 200 miles of cables. A supercomputer can consume 5,000 gallons of water per minute and do so to stay cool. A supercomputer can consume as much electricity as 10,000 homes. A supercomputer can weigh as much as a commercial airplane. Parallel processing is the vital technology that powers the world's most powerful supercomputers. The use of parallel processing to solve the toughest problems is limited to the imagination of supercomputer scientists of tomorrow. What is parallel processing? Imagine that 200 million Nigerians were invited to queue in only one line and to vote at the rate of one voter per minute. This process will take 200 million minutes or 380 years, allowing only one person to vote at a time and only at one polling station is akin to solving only one problem at a time and only at one processor. This sequential processing technology was the basic knowledge behind the old one processor technology that powered the old supercomputers, including the conventional supercomputers of the 1940s, through the vector supercomputers of the 1980s. On the 4th of July 1989, I discovered practical parallel processing, and I discovered it as the vital technology that now underpins every supercomputer and hopefully will underpin every computer. The incorporation of parallel processing technology into every supercomputer is the reason the supercomputer that was formerly the size of the refrigerator now occupies the space of a soccer field. I believe that a word that has been used for 2,000 years is likely to be used for another 2,000 years. The word computer was in human vocabulary for 2,000 years. The word computer could remain in our descendants' vocabulary for another 2,000 years. But the computer of 2,000 years from today is expected to be vastly different from the computer of today. I believe that by the end of the 21st century, that our children's children will develop a new internet technology that will encapsulate the internet that I invented as processors that encircled a globe and did so in the manner the internet encircles planet Earth. That new internet will be a new supercomputer that will be a subset of the entire planetary-sized internet. The computer has always been and could always be a machinery that is used to perform the fastest computations and that solves the most computation-intensive problems and solve them automatically and sometimes in parallel. By definition and by necessity, the supercomputer of the future will be the planetary-sized computer that performs the fastest computations. I believe that in a century, the internet will become the network of humans that will be directly wired into the internet and that automatically sends and receives the fastest telepathic email communications as opposed to a network of only processors and computers that it is today. Parallel processing is the crown jewel inside every supercomputer. Parallel processing was the stone that was marked as rough and unsightly and rejected. Parallel processing originated as a vague science fiction story that was dated February 1, 1952. From 1958 to 1989, the usefulness of the parallel supercomputing was debated in computer science literature. Parallel processing was the stone the builders of supercomputers rejected as rough and unsightly, only for it to become the crown jewel inside every supercomputer. My discovery of practical parallel supercomputing that occurred on the 4th of July 1989 made the news headlines because that new knowledge was considered to be a paradigm shift or a change in the way we look at what makes the supercomputer super. In the old way, called sequential processing or vector processing, the supercomputer had only one electronic brain. In my new way, called parallel processing, the supercomputer is powered by 65,536 brains and can be powered by 1 billion brains. That was how I invented the Philip Emeagwali formula for the world's fastest supercomputer that then US President Bill Clinton described in his White House speech of August 26, 2000. My signature invention was the fastest supercomputer that was not a computer per se, but that was a new internet de facto, that was a new global network of 65,536 processors that were tightly coupled to each other, that were equal distances apart from each other, that shared nothing between each other. Each processor operated its own operating system. The discovery of the new knowledge that is used to make the fastest computer super that occurred on the 4th of July 1989 was my eureka moment. My contribution to the development of the computer is this. I answered a grand challenge question that was posed 67 years earlier, back on February 1, 1922. My invention timeline was this. Back in 1970 in Nigeria, I computed with a slide rule or a manually operated computer. Then on June 20, 1974, at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, United States, I began programming an automatic programmable supercomputer that was rated at 1 million instructions per second and ranked as the world's fastest supercomputer when it was manufactured back in December 1965. That supercomputer was only automatic within only one processor. the Philip Emeagwali formula that then US President Bill Clinton spoke about on August 26, 2000 was my discovery that we can solve a grand challenge initial boundary value problem that is the toughest and the most important problem in science and engineering, and solve them automatically, both within and across each processor of my new internet, that is a new global network of 65,536 processors that were tightly coupled to each other. My contribution to the development of the supercomputer is this. I discovered how to make the supercomputers of the 1940s through 80s to become obsolete. Within the new supercomputer that I discovered on the 4th of July 1989, 65,536 processors replaced the singular processor that computed alone. I invented practical parallel supercomputing, and I did so in 2 stages. First, I programmed all my 2 raised to power 16, or 65,536 processors to automatically send and receive my emailed codes and data, and do so across 16 times as many email wires, and to communicate with each of my 64 binary thousand processors. Second, I programmed each processor to automatically compute and do so simultaneously and across all 65,536 processors that uniformly encircled a globe as a new internet and encircled the globe in the manner computers encircle the earth. An internet is a global network of processors that encircles a globe. That internet might occupy the space of a soccer field or might encircle the earth itself. That internet might be a supercomputer de facto or might be the internet itself per se. The technology defines the name, not the name defines the technology. For my discovery of practical parallel supercomputing that occurred on the 4th of July 1989, that subsequently made the news headlines, I defined my globe the way mathematicians prefer, namely as a 16-dimensional hypersphere within a 16-dimensional hyperspace. I visualized the 2 raised to power 16 or 64 binary thousand processors that I programmed and used to solve grand challenge problems as being equal distances apart and distributed across the 15-dimensional hypersurface of that hypersphere. In contrast to my neatly organized and interconnected processors, the computers that outline the internet, that encircle the earth, were added organically and incrementally and are non-identical to each other and non-equidistant from each other. And as a result of those irregularities and non-uniformities, the email communications between the computers on the internet must be asynchronously sent and received. And for that reason, the internet itself cannot be harnessed and used to solve the grand challenge initial boundary value problems that is a recurring decimal in extreme scale mathematics and computational physics. The email messaging within my supercomputer is processor to processor emailing, not your everyday person to computer to person emailing. I discovered practical parallel supercomputing when I figured out how to automatically program across my new internet and how to communicate synchronously while computing simultaneously and doing both as the precondition for recording the fastest computation that can arise from within the fastest computer in the world. That quote-unquote fastest computer is not a computer per se. I discovered that the fastest computer is a virtual supercomputer that is an internet de facto. I was in the news headlines because I figured out how to harness the slowest processors in the world and harness them around a new internet, and do so to record speeds in supercomputing that were previously unrecorded. I invented the world's fastest computer that computes across a new internet, that is a new global network of 2 raised to the power 16 or 65,536 commodity off-the-shelf processors that were equal distances apart from each other and that were identical to each other and that were tightly coupled to each other and that tightly encircled a globe that is shaped like a 16-dimensional hypersphere in 16-dimensional hyperspace. I also envisioned my new global network of 64 binary thousand processors as married together as one cohesive supercomputing machinery and married together by 16 times 2 raised to the power 16 or 1,048,576 bidirectional email wires that were uniform and regular and that were etched onto the 15-dimensional surface of that globe that was shaped like a 16-dimensional hypersphere in hyperspace. In the modern configuration of supercomputers and at 1 foot per email wire, those email wires will total 200 miles of cable. This never before seen internet is called the Philip Emeagwali Internet. My eureka moment of 8:15 in the morning of the 4th of July 1989 made the news headlines around the globe in 1989 and did so because I was the first person to discover how to compute simultaneously and around a globe, or how to compute around a new internet that is a new global network of tightly coupled processors that shared nothing between each other. That is, I de facto invented the world's fastest computer, and I invented it by discovering how and why parallel processing is the vital technology that will make every supercomputer super. My world's fastest computation occurred after I discovered how to communicate synchronously and do so around a new global network of powers of 2 processors that is called the Philip Emeagwali Internet. In the 1970s, my ideas of massively parallel supercomputing were not fully formed. For that reason, my earliest research reports were mocked and ridiculed, and I was offhandedly dismissed for espousing a beautiful theory that lacked an experimental confirmation. In the 1970s and 80s, massively parallel processing was dismissed as a supercomputing theory that will never gain many adherents. That is, the idea of harnessing the potential supercomputing power of an ensemble of 65,536 processors was ludicrous. That was the reason I was the only full-time programmer of that ensemble of 2 raised to the power 16 processors. For the 10 years onward of 1979, my research report on the then unorthodox parallel supercomputer grew from a few pages to 1,057 pages. In 1989, my 40-page highlights of my 1,057-page research report won the top prize in supercomputing and made the news headlines. Looking back to the 1980s in the US, a rejection pattern that repeated itself dozens of times was this. I would get a telephone interview for a job that was advertised and get it because I had the most hands-on experience in supercomputing. During the interview, the interviewer is taken aback when he discovers that I am Black and African-born. In the 1970s and 80s, there were so few Black vector supercomputer scientists that even I would have been shocked if I had seen a Black African giving my lecture on massively parallel supercomputing. I experienced this cognitive dissonance the first time I attended a research seminar in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1992 that was delivered by a very dark-skinned mathematician of African descent. She was known to the white mathematicians, but I, the only Black mathematician in the audience, was the only person in the auditorium that was in a state of denial. It's ironic that the only Black male mathematician in the audience of mathematicians was the only person that denied that the Black female mathematician was a genius. Her lecture was on the ergodic theory of dynamical systems. I presume that she might not have the command of her materials. She proved me wrong. Similarly, it was presumed that it would be impossible to find a young Black and gifted mathematician that can solve the toughest problem arising in extreme scale computational mathematics. That was the reason only one person attended my research seminar on supercomputing that I delivered in November 1982 in a large auditorium that was a short walk from the White House, Washington, D.C. My subsequent discovery of practical parallel processing that occurred 7 years later and that made the news headlines was theorized in that supercomputing seminar that all but one person boycotted. By the late 1980s, I realized that my discovery that practical parallel processing will become the vital technology that will underpin every supercomputer will only be accepted if and only if white supercomputer scientists think that I am white. That was the reason I mailed the research report of my invention of practical parallel supercomputing to an independent committee of supercomputer scientists that were 2,500 miles away in San Francisco, California. The 4 members of that supercomputer committee were appointed by the president of the Computer Society, that was the largest branch of the IEEE, the acronym for the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. That is the world's largest technical society. The Computer Society was the world's largest of its kind. That committee of foremost experts in supercomputing were tasked with awarding the top prize in supercomputing. The essence of the 40-page report that I submitted to the IEEE and the detailed 1,057-page research report that won the prize in supercomputing is this. I discovered that practical parallel processing will become the vital technology that will underpin every supercomputer. The news of my invention of practical parallel supercomputing spread like wildfire and quickly made it to the dailies in many countries. I discovered how to harness a new internet that comprised of a global network of 65,536 processors that encircled a globe, and how to harness that new internet to solve the toughest mathematical problems arising in science and engineering. And I discovered how to solve grand challenge problems and solve them 65,536 times faster than one processor solving the same problem alone. What is the future of the internet? I believe that in 1,000 years, our descendants will not have computers around them. Their computers will be within them instead of around them. Our post-human descendants of the million will not need computers because there will be computers that encircle and enshroud planet Earth. Our post-human descendants will be half humans and half processors that are akin to the cyborgs in science fiction movies. I won the top award in supercomputing in 1989, and I did so for my contributions to the development of the practical parallel supercomputer. After years of being denied credit for my inventions, I learned to take the credit for my invention of practical parallel processing, the technology that underpins every supercomputer. I owe it to the 12-year-old writing an inventor report on Philip Emeagwali to keep the credit for my contributions that he or she is reporting on. That was the reason I spoke up for myself back in 1989 and showcased my contributions to the development of the computer. Success breeds jealousy and haters. Becoming a famous supercomputer scientist was like putting a large target on my back. Like any prominent black inventor of the past, I had doubters who envied me and worked tirelessly and anonymously to discredit my science. In 1989, I won the top prize in the field of supercomputing and did so for discovering how to solve a grand challenge problem, and specifically for figuring out how to solve them across an ensemble of 65,536 processors. In 1989, I was the supercomputer scientist behind my discovery of how to harness a new parallel supercomputer and how to use that new technology to solve the toughest real-world problems, such as fluid dynamical calculations called general circulation models of atmospheric and oceanic flows that I use to predict global warming, and petroleum reservoir simulators that I use to recover more crude oil and natural gas that are buried 1 mile deep within an oil field that is the size of a town. As the inventor of practical parallel supercomputing, I was the only person that could deliver the first public lecture that answers that grand challenge question. Being the inventor created deep grooves of my ownership of practical parallel supercomputing, and most importantly, I was the only supercomputer scientist of the 1980s that can show someone else how to massively parallel process and how to do so across a new internet that is a new global network of 65,536 processors. That command of materials and deep knowledge of mathematics, physics, and supercomputing, and that control via emails of my 64 binary thousand processors made my lectures of massively parallel supercomputing more authoritative as well as compelling. As a research mathematician, I stood out because I was the only person that recorded the world's fastest speed in supercomputing, and did so while solving the initial boundary value problem of mathematical physics. That achievement was the reason I was the only person that won the top prize in the field of supercomputing and won it alone, and did so when up to 50 persons are teaming up to win that prize. A century ago, the average scientific paper had only one author. Today, the average scientific paper has 6 authors. The paper on the experimental discovery of the Higgs boson had 3,061 co-discoverers of the Higgs boson. A boson is an elementary particle that is believed to be responsible for all physical forces. For my country of birth, Nigeria, poverty cannot be reduced by searching for a huge deposit of crude oil and natural gas and discovering it in Sokoto of the far northeastern region of Nigeria. Poverty alleviation cannot be achieved from recovering only 50% of that crude oil deposit and then paying 40% of that 50% as exploration royalty to a foreign company. That's like recovering only 30% of the crude oil and natural gas that was originally discovered. Economic growth for oil-producing nations such as Nigeria resides in having the brain power to earn the remaining 70% of the potential revenue from the Niger Delta oil fields of the southeastern region of Nigeria. The first step in alleviating poverty in Africa is to increase Africa's intellectual capital and do so by reversing the brain drain from Africa to the United States, and do so by also attracting skilled non-Africans such as African Americans to live and work in Africa, and do so by Africans being at the frontier of human knowledge and Africans being at that unknown world where African innovators could imagine the unimaginable. Discoveries and inventions are to science and technology what new songs and new movies are to the entertainment industry. The invention is to technology what the new song is to music. Inventions make living easier for everybody. Discoveries make the world a better place and a more knowledgeable one. I'm Philip Emeagwali. The internet has many fathers and mothers, as well as aunts and uncles, that did not invent a new internet. The father of the internet should at least invent a new internet. I am called a father of the internet because I am the only father of the internet that invented a new internet. Back in 1989, I was in the news headlines because I was the first person to discover how to parallel process real-world problems and how to do so across millions upon millions of processors that were tightly coupled to each other. In parallel supercomputing across my new internet that was a new global network of 65,536 processors that were identical to each other. The most important knowledge is to fully understand how to control and harness every processor that was within my global network of processors. Each processor operated its own operating system. In 1989, I made the news headlines when I recorded the maximum possible speed increase across my ensemble of 65,536 commodity off-the-shelf processors. That parallel processed speed increase of a factor of 65,536 that was then considered impossible led to my discovery that parallel supercomputing will be the vital technology that will make computers faster and make supercomputers fastest. I discovered practical parallel supercomputing and did so by making a one-to-one corresponded and metaphorical mapping, and doing so from the vertices of the hypercube to each processor, and by making another one-to-one corresponded mapping from the bidirectional edges of the hypercube to my email wires. Unlike your cube, my hypercube was defined in 16-dimensional hyperspace and therefore has 2 raised to power 16 or 64 binary thousand vertices and 16 times as many or 1 binary million bidirectional edges. Programming 64 binary thousand tightly coupled processors to work together to forecast the weather was in the realm of science fiction and would have been dismissed as an act of insanity, and dismissed when I began programming supercomputers back on June 20, 1974 at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, United States. But on the 4th of July 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States, I discovered how to turn that science fiction into non-fiction that is used to forecast the weather for your evening news. As the first person to make the news headlines for discovering practical parallel supercomputing, I visualized the vertices and the edges of a hypercube that were etched onto the surface of my hypersphere. I invented the Philip Emeagwali Internet as corresponding to the cut-out silhouette that was my topological metaphor for the appearance of my new internet that has a new global network of 65,536 processors that were identical to each other and that were tightly coupled to each other. That new supercomputer and the new internet were like tightly conjoined twins with only one superbrain. In 1989, I was in the news headlines because I discovered practical parallel supercomputing and invented it as the vital technology that now underpins every supercomputer and that enabled me to compute faster and across my new internet and to compute faster than any supercomputer that ever existed. I envisioned my new virtual supercomputer as my new internet. My first visions of my new internet began as a dark shape and as an outline of a blank global network of processors that were connected with email wires that were empty messages. That dark shape of my new internet remained visible inside my mind. It's impossible for me to walk alone and program that new internet and do so without intellectually seeing the exact positions in 16-dimensional space of each of my 65,536 processors. It's also impossible for me to send and receive email messages across my 1,048,576 bidirectional email wires and do so correctly without knowing in advance the exact positions in hyperspace of my 65,536 processors. As the first parallel supercomputer scientist, I was not trying to see with my naked eyes any of my 65,536 processors or any of my 1,048,576 bidirectional email wires that married my commodity processors together and did so to form a new internet that tightly circumscribed a globe in 16-dimensional hyperspace. In contrast, I only saw my new supercomputer and my new internet inside my mind, not with my naked eyes, as was often presumed. In a sense, I saw my new internet in its entirety, the way you saw our planet Earth in its entirety, and understood that it is not flat, and do so with your mind, not by encircling it around the Earth in a spacecraft. I visualized how to email my 65,536 computer codes, as well as email as many sets of data that I used at the mathematical physics core of my initial boundary value problems. That was how I preloaded each of my 65,536 processors. I visualized how to continuously pump my email messages across my new internet. I visualized each of my email messages as having 5 subject lines and having no message body, and as traversing across my new global network of 1,048,576 email wires that outlined my new internet. In my mind, I sketched my silhouette as the dark shadow of a new internet that encircles the earth. That shadow was created by the sun. The partial differential equations that I invented are the most advanced expressions in calculus. Those partial differential equations are far more abstract than the quadratic equation, and for that reason, the layperson cannot scribble them across the blackboard or solve them on or across motherboards. The system of 9 partial differential equations that I invented are abstract and are de facto invincible. However, I used those partial differential equations as my extreme scaled computational test beds for inventing a new computer, a new supercomputer, and a new internet. In the lecture series on my contributions to mathematics that I posted on Emeagwali on youtube.com/Emeagwali, I described in prose, rather than in abstract mathematics, how I coded my initial boundary value problem that we are governed by a system of partial differential equations of calculus. And I did so differently. I did not code my initial boundary value problem for only one processor, as was done by other computational mathematicians. I paradigm shifted by parallel supercomputing my initial boundary value problem, and doing so across a new internet that is a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. That solitary act of repetitive coding for each processor that defined and outlined that new internet was my form of meditation. The very essence of my ensemble of processors was to use emails to weave together my new global network of 64 binary thousand processors and to invent a new internet that is one whole cohesive virtual supercomputer that is not a computer per se. In my mind, those 64 binary thousand slowest processors were de facto the fastest supercomputer that was my metaphor for a futuristic, thought-provoking, and poetic internet. That is, I rethought my new computer as my new internet and vice versa. I visualize my email messages as traversing across the interior of the 16-dimensional hyperspace and along the bidirectional edges of the hypercube in that hyperspace. I gave form to that ensemble and gave form to it as a never before seen internet. For me, that new global network of processors that were tightly coupled to each other, that were equal distances apart from each other, and that shared nothing between each other, became a mathematicized and abstracted internet that is a singular virtual supercomputer. I was in the news in 1989 and thereafter because I was the first person to parallel process across a new internet that was a new global network of 65,536 processors that shared nothing between them. I was the first person to theoretically discover that no upper limit exists when parallel supercomputing across an infinite number of processors. Put differently, my inspiration is this: the science fiction of planetary parallel supercomputing across the entire internet that encircled planet Earth could become the non-fiction of our descendants. I was the first person to discover how to parallel process across a new internet that I visualized as a small copy of the planet-sized internet. For that invention that was conceived back in 1974 and completed in 1989, whenever the phrase "father of the internet" is mentioned, the first name that Google suggests is Philip Emeagwali. The contributions to the development of the computer that are the subject of school reports are inventions that are paradigm shifting or that change the way we look at the computer. The objective criterion for measuring contributions to the development of the computer is fixed, namely the fastest computation that was executed by any means necessary. My fastest computation that I discovered on the 4th of July 1989 was executed by parallel supercomputing a grand challenge initial boundary value problem of extreme scale computational physics and solving it across a new internet that was a new global network of 65,536 processors that were tightly coupled to each other, that were identical to each other, that were equal distances apart from each other, but that shared nothing between each other. My scientific discovery that occurred on the 4th of July 1989 was that parallel processing will become the vital technology that will make the modern supercomputer super. That discovery made the news headlines because it will change the way we look at the computer. I discovered that we should look at the modern computer not as a computing machinery per se, but as a new internet de facto. That never before seen internet derives its supercomputer horsepower by parallel processing its computational workload across its millions of processors that were tightly coupled to each other, with each processor operating its own operating system. For me, Philip Emeagwali, that technological breakthrough in massively parallel processing was the supercomputer news headlines that crossed the sea from San Francisco, California to Onitsha, Nigeria, and crossed the sea because it broke new grounds of supercomputing across 65,536 tightly coupled processors that equidistantly encircled a globe that defined and outlined a new internet. Back on June 20, 1974, at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, United States, I began programming the first computer to be rated at 1 million instructions per second. The first supercomputer was invented in 1946. That first supercomputer was 100 feet long, 10 feet wide, 10 feet tall, and 3 feet deep. So supercomputers were programmed for 28 years before I began to do so. But those supercomputers only solved one problem at a time instead of solving a billion problems at once. But at 8:15 in the morning of the 4th of July 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States, I became the first person to discover practical parallel supercomputing. That discovery made the news headlines because it was said to be impossible to parallel process a grand challenge problem and do so across a new internet, that is a new global network of unlimited number of processors that were tightly coupled to each other and that shared nothing between each other. The grand challenge problems solved on supercomputers remain essentially the same, but the value and size of the supercomputer market has grown from $7 million back in 1946 to $20 billion a year, or a factor of 3,000. The information technology market is $5 trillion, with more than 40% of that market in North America, primarily in the United States, where nearly 2 million skilled persons are employed in the IT sector. The supercomputer that Japan has on its drawing board will cost $1.25 billion. As a massively parallel supercomputer scientist that came of age in the 1970s and 80s, I walked and walked alone because I took the road less traveled. But I also got noticed more because I did my parallel supercomputer research under unusual circumstances that took me from Onitsha to Oregon back on March 23, 1974. In the 1970s and 80s, no sub-Saharan African-born scientific researcher was hired by any of the numerous US nuclear research laboratories where most supercomputing research was conducted. In 1989, I discovered that a grand challenge problem can be divided into millions of smaller, less challenging problems, and then I further discovered that I could use as many email messages to puzzle together those small problems into the original grand challenge problem that I could then solve across my new internet, that is my new global network of as many processors that each operated its own operating system and that each shared nothing with other nearest neighboring processors. I'm Philip Emeagwali. Back in 1989, I was in the news headlines because I discovered how the slowest processors can be parallel processed and harnessed to solve once impossible to solve problems and solve them at previously impossible speeds. My discovery created a need for the parallel supercomputer. My discovery of practical parallel supercomputing made the news headlines because it was akin to discovering an undiscovered continent of the unknown world of the new computer and the new internet. The use of 64,000 human computers to parallel process the weather was published as a science fiction story back on February 1, 1922, and published in the book titled Weather Prediction by Numerical Process. The contribution of Philip Emeagwali to the development of the computer is this: I upgraded parallel supercomputing from fiction to non-fiction. So for 67 years onward of 1922, parallel processing was the big and unanswered question of the field of computing, and for that reason, the quest to answer it was described as the grand challenge problem of the field of supercomputing. For 67 years, onward of 1922, mathematical scientists attempted to solve the toughest initial boundary value problems and to solve them by dividing each into smaller problems that could be parallel processed with one problem to one processor correspondence and mapped onto 1 million identical processors that were tightly coupled to each other. Until my discovery of the 4th of July 1989, progress in solving such grand challenge problems and solving them by parallel processing them was a modest factor of 8. That factor was erroneously decreed by Amdahl's law of diminishing returns expected from the increase in the speed of supercomputers. My contribution to supercomputing is this. I figured out how parallel supercomputing works, and that discovery changed the way we look at the supercomputer that occupies the space of a soccer field and changed the way we look at the fastest computer that can be placed on your desk. The computer is a machinery that performs fast calculations. The massively parallel supercomputer is the fastest computer. The Philip Emeagwali Internet is a global network of commodity off-the-shelf processors that were identical to each other, that were tightly coupled to each other, that were equal distances apart from each other, that shared nothing between each other. Each processor operated its own operating system. My contributions to knowledge is this. I discovered a new internet that is a new global network of processors or tiny computers that is not a computer per se, but that is a supercomputer de facto. Who invented the internet? The internet has many fathers and mothers, as well as aunts and uncles. But only one father of the internet invented a new internet. The father of the internet should at least contribute new technological knowledge that pertains to the internet, and do so by inventing a new internet. I am called a father of the internet because I am the only father of the internet that invented a new internet. I was asked, when the games are over, how will you want to be remembered? What's been around the longest will stay around the longest. 1 million years ago, our pre-human ancestors counted on their fingers and toes. I believe that in 1 million years, our post-human descendants will count across their million internet. I will be remembered the longest for my contributions to computational mathematics that changed the way we count and changed it from counting only one thing at a time to counting 1 billion things at once. I will be remembered for my contributions that changed the way we looked at the computer and changed it from one isolated processor computing only one thing at a time to 1 billion processors, supercomputing for the parallel processed solution of the toughest real-world problems. We remember mathematicians from 3,000 years ago if and only if their contributions to mathematics is still relevant. We remember Euclid as the father of geometry because geometry is taught in schools. We remember we will remember the computational mathematician that changed the way we count. Since prehistoric times, our pre-human ancestors counted only one thing at a time. I discovered that we could solve real-world problems by counting a billion things at once or by parallel supercomputing the toughest mathematical problems. We will remember the father of the internet if and only if the internet is still relevant in year million. I am the only father of the internet that invented a new internet. I will be remembered as the first parallel supercomputer scientist that came of age on the 4th of July 1989. That is my legacy and my contribution to human knowledge that changed the world of computers. I was inducted by the United Nations into its gallery of prominent refugees. The United Nations distributed posters of Philip Emeagwali to refugee camps in Kenya, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone. And I was getting emails from those refugee camps inviting me to visit their camps. What is Philip Emeagwali famous for? I became known by word of mouth and as follows. In 1989, a 12-year-old wrote a school inventor report on the contributions of Philip Emeagwali to the development of the computer. That school inventor report is discussed with her classmates and at her family dinner table or during conversations with her younger friends. The following year, those younger friends are more likely to write school inventor reports on Philip Emeagwali. That word-of-mouth spreading of school inventor reports and its stickiness is more effective than media mentions. Often, students forget how to spell the name Philip Emeagwali, but they have no problem remembering to search for the Nigerian who invented the fastest computer, or the African who invented a new internet, that is a new global network of processors. I became known via newspaper and magazine articles that were published after my discovery of practical parallel processing, practical parallel supercomputing that occurred on the 4th of July 1989. I discovered practical parallel supercomputing and discovered it as the vital technology that will make the supercomputer super. The first audience to discover my story were American school children writing school reports on the theme, famous mathematicians and their contributions to mathematics, or great scientists in history, or great inventors and their inventions. Some of those children wrote school reports on Philip Emeagwali and did so in part because their father or mother wrote a school report on Philip Emeagwali. The second audience that discovered my contributions to science were Nigerians and Africans in the continent and in the diaspora. Shortly after the Christmas of 1989 in San Francisco, California, the office of the largest technical organization called the IEEE, as well as some other institutions, issued press releases that announced that I had discovered practical parallel supercomputing and discovered it as the vital technology that will power every supercomputer, and that I had invented how to harness 65,536 processors to solve the toughest initial boundary value problems arising in mathematical physics, and that I had discovered how to solve that grand challenge problem and solve it at the world's fastest supercomputer speeds, and that I had solved the problem at the then unheard of speed of 3.1 billion calculations per 3.1 billion floating point arithmetical operations per second. Those 1989 press releases of my discovery of practical parallel supercomputing were picked up by newspapers and magazines, and I began getting requests for media interviews. For the decade preceding 1989, I was mocked and made fun of while I worked alone on parallel supercomputing. But as I became famous, those vector supercomputer scientists that mocked and made fun of me and that refused to work jointly with me and become my co-discoverer of practical parallel supercomputing turned around and insisted that they will now become my new best friend and that I should allow them to become my co-inventors. Their motive was this: if they had collaborated with me and did so for only 1 minute, they would have gone to the court to fight for a share of the credit for my invention of practical parallel supercomputing and for the invention that I had already invented and invented without any contribution from them. In the old style of supercomputing, the conventional supercomputer solves grand challenge initial boundary value problems arising in extreme scale computational physics and takes forever to solve them in a step-by-step fashion that is called serial computing. On the 4th of July 1989, I discovered a new way of solving those grand challenge problems, namely chopping them into a million smaller, less challenging initial boundary value problems, and then simultaneously solving them across a million processors and solving them in a one problem to one processor corresponded mapping that will result in a million-fold speed increase. I visualized my processors as identical to each other and as equal distances apart from each other, and as interconnected by identical email wires that were lying on the surface of a globe that was represented by a hypersphere in a 16-dimensional hyperspace. In my July 4, 1989 physical parallel supercomputing experiment that made the news headlines in 1989, I divided the grand challenge initial boundary value problem of simulating the flow of crude oil, injected water, and natural gas across an oil field that is 1 mile deep and that is the size of a town. I did so by dividing that oil field into 2 raised to power 16 or 65,536 smaller oil fields. I emailed my supercomputer codes and their companion data that I used to simulate each of my smaller oil fields and emailed them to and from 16-bit long email addresses. And I emailed them along 16 times to raise to power 16 email wires. That is, I emailed my data and codes across a new internet and into each processor within my new global network of 64 binary thousand processors that were equal distances apart and that were on the surface of a globe in the 16th dimension. That was how I solved the grand challenge problem of supercomputing and how I discovered how parallel processing makes the computer faster and makes the supercomputer fastest, and discovered how to always manufacture the world's fastest computer and do so with the technology of massively parallel processing. I was born on August 23, 1954, in a small hospital in the British West African colony of Nigeria. The first house that I lived in was the boys' quarter of a small house for servants that was associated with a big house that was at the intersection of Oke-Emeso Street and Oba Adesida Road, Akure, Nigeria, British West Africa. My mother, Inyamma Agatha Emeagwali, had just celebrated her 15th birth date and did so 6 days before I was born. The precursor to the modern computer was 8 years old when I was born. In 1954, the British colony of Nigeria had a population of 40 million and then had only 150 lawyers, 160 medical doctors, and 1 trained engineer. When I was born, the word computer was not in the Nigerian vocabulary. Even in the US, the word supercomputer was not in the vocabulary of computer programmers of 1946 through 1967. The word supercomputer was first used in 1967. When I say, quote unquote, the internet, I mean the global network of computers that encircles planet Earth. When I say, quote unquote, an internet, I mean a global network of processors that encircles a globe. I use the word internet to describe my global network of commodity off-the-shelf processors that were tightly coupled to each other, that shared nothing between each other. I visualize the emails that I sent to and received from each of my 64 binary thousand processors as having traveled along my 1,048,576 email wires that I visualize as etched onto the 15-dimensional hypersurface of a globe that is a hypersphere in my 16th dimensional mathematical hyperspace. The actual global circulation model that is used for climate studies that inspired my invention of my new internet that new global network of 65,536 processors was also defined around a globe in 3-dimensional physical space. The geophysical flows of air and water are at the core of global warming simulations we are modeled by using a set of laws of physics that always includes the second law of motion of physics that was discovered 330 years ago. The second law of motion was encoded into a system of coupled, nonlinear, time-dependent, and 3-dimensional partial differential equations that I discretized and reduced to a system of equations of algebra that I parallel processed across 64 binary thousand commodity off-the-shelf processors that were tightly coupled to each other and that shared nothing between each other. That is, I discovered how to simulate the planetary motions of the air and water that enshroud the Earth, that is a globe of 7,917.5 miles in diameter. I discovered how to simulate and parallel process around a new global network of processors that is a new internet and a new supercomputer de facto. That was how I invented a new internet that encircled a globe, and how I invented that internet and used it to solve a grand challenge, initial boundary value problem that enshrouded a globe, namely planet Earth. At its mathematical physics core, that grand challenge problem is an extreme scaled computational physics code developed for the high resolution simulation that must be used to predict global warming. In the geometry of higher dimensions, the globe is defined and outlined by a hypersphere that in turn is defined as a set of points at equal distance from a given point called the center. In my physical experiment that revealed the world's fastest supercomputer and revealed it on July 4, 1989, I visualized my 64 binary thousand commodity off-the-shelf processors that used high-speed interconnects that comprised of 1 binary million email wires as evenly distributed around a mathematical globe in the 16th dimension that in turn was projected and etched onto the two-dimensional surface of a physical globe in the third dimension. The hypersphere that I used to define my 2 raised to power 16 commodity off-the-shelf processors is my generalization of the sphere to the 16th dimension. The hypercube is the similar generalization of the cube from the third dimension to the 16th. I visualize my virtual supercomputer not as a computer as others did, but as a new internet that is a new global network of processors. I was in the news because I figured out how to harness my 65,536 processors and how to command and control them to automatically send and synchronously receive the codes and data associated with my as many initial boundary value problems of mathematical physics. Those codes and data traveled through 16 times 2 raised to power 16 or 1 binary million bidirectional email wires that had a 1 email wire to 1 hypercube edge correspondence to the as many bidirectional edges of the hypercube in the 16th dimensional mathematical hyperspace. By comparison, your everyday emails are manually sent to you and delivered via a computer. Your email that traveled from Nigeria to the United States was routed across the globe or the internet. That internet encircled planet Earth, that is a globe that has a diameter of 7,917.5 miles. In contrast, my emails around my global network of processors were automated and synchronized across an ensemble of 65,536 processors that I visualized as a new internet in the 16th dimension. I visualized my new internet as defined across the surface of a hypersphere, that is a globe in higher dimensions, that in turn tightly enshrouded a hypercube, that is a cube in higher dimensions. I visualized the 16 times 2 raised to power 16 or the 1 binary million bidirectional edges as projected onto its 15-dimensional hypersurface. The honeycomb was the first of my 2 diagrammatic expressions of my new global networks of commodity off-the-shelf processors that were identical to each other, that were equal distances apart from each other, that shared nothing between each other, in which each processor operated its own operating system. To others, my honeycomb and hyperbole diagrams represented a supercomputer, but I emphasize that it was also a new internet, that is a new global network of processors that tightly circumscribed a globe in 3-dimensional space and in 16-dimensional hyperspace, respectively. That distinction was pivotal. Those two inventions were the reasons I became the most searched for and the recurring decimal in discussions on the contributions of the black man that invented a new internet. I'm Philip Emeagwali. I am the only father of the internet that invented a new internet. Thank you. The inventor discovered the possibilities in the world of the impossible. My quest for a never-before-seen massively parallel supercomputer that was also a new internet de facto was to discover the possibilities in the world of the impossible, or to show that the impossible to compute is in fact possible to compute. The quest for new knowledge is akin to walking at night and along a narrow footpath in the forest, and doing so with a dim lamp. My massively parallel supercomputer research was my personal quest for the new way to the unknown world of the never-before-seen ensemble of millions of processors that were identical to each other, that were equal distances apart from each other, that outline and define a new internet that is a virtual supercomputer de facto. In the 1970s and 80s, I walked alone along that path, and I was only guided by a dim lamp. Kwame Nkrumah said, "Socialism without science is void," and said, "Forward ever, backward never." Kwame Nkrumah also said, "We face neither east nor west, we face forward." I say that science moves humanity forward ever. Back on the 4th of July 1989, I discovered that a new internet that is comprised of a new global network of the slowest 65,536 processors can be harnessed and used to solve the toughest problems arising in science and engineering, and used to solve those problems faster than any supercomputer. China copied that massively parallel supercomputing technology and updated it from my 65,536 processors to its world's fastest supercomputer that is powered by 10,649,600 processors. Parallel processing is the crown jewel inside every supercomputer. My discovery of practical parallel supercomputing helped China to assemble some of the world's fastest supercomputers. That discovery is the vital technology that upgraded China as one of the world's supercomputing superpower. However, the race to build the world's fastest supercomputer is the race to knowledge, not the race to the moon. My discovery of practical parallel supercomputing that occurred on the 4th of July 1989 put the super into the supercomputer. My discovery of practical parallel supercomputing is akin to having 10,649,600 election polling stations in Nigeria and having only 19 voters queued at each polling station, and consequently completing the election in 19 minutes instead of in 380 years. That reduction of election time from 4 centuries of time to election to merely 20 minutes is the basic principle that changed the way we understand how to put the super into the supercomputer. The discovery of practical parallel supercomputing that occurred on the 4th of July, 1989, opened our eyes and enabled us to see the supercomputer in a different way. How does the new parallel supercomputer benefit you? The next time the weather forecast made you reach for your umbrella, you did so because the parallel supercomputer was used to make that forecast. The next time you drive your car, you did so in part because the parallel supercomputer was used to discover and recover the crude oil that was refined as the fuel in your car. That is the reason 1 in 10 supercomputers are purchased by the petroleum industry. If you were evacuating your family and doing so in response to a tsunami flooding or an earthquake warning, then you should send a thank you note to your parallel supercomputer scientist for enabling the tsunami or earthquake forecast that saved your family's lives. And if you own a self-driving car, you should credit that technology to the parallel supercomputer that is within your self-driving car that enables it to train itself over time. And that's how the new parallel supercomputer benefits you. Thank you.
Insightful and brilliant lecture. Insightful and brilliant lecture.